our scope of work right now, per the notice of the meeting, is the Canadian response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of our witnesses made this comment about helping to ensure Canadian companies remain Canadian, which I think is really important. The COVID-19 crisis has precipitated reports of significant devaluation of companies that hold strategic Canadian assets, including significant intellectual property, natural resources, and more. In turn, there have been questions raised about whether the current thresholds to trigger a net benefit review under the Investment Canada Act need to be adjusted, as well as what type of purchases of Canadian companies and strategic assets by state-owned enterprises of authoritarian countries should be tolerated. And I think that this issue is important. It should be looked into objectively, immediately, and is directly material to the business of reviewing the Canadian response to the COVID-19 crisis. So as such, I move that, given the House motion made last week granted the committee's power to study outside of their usual scope, the Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology conduct a study on the Investment Canada Act, that this study determine the extent to which companies within strategic Canadian industries have been devalued as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, the extent to which foreign buyouts may occur, determine whether the current Investment Canada Act valuation thresholds are adequate to trigger a net benefit review given the potential extreme devaluation of companies within strategic Canadian industries, determine whether Canada should place a temporary moratorium on acquisitions from state-owned enterprises of authoritarian countries, that the study consists of no less than 4 meetings, and the study be completed by June 21st, 2020, and that the committee table its findings, and that the government table a comprehensive report. Thank you, Madam Chair. Over to you.
So with that, we have a motion on the floor, and I open the floor for debate.
Yes, Madam Chair.
Yes.
The motion on the floor, I'd like to be reviewed. 48-hour notice on the motion. Maybe when we come back, we can have discussion on it.
So technically, while it is in fact related to COVID-19 and the study that we are doing, it is admissible. However, I'd like to ask Madame Rempel Garner if she'd like to allow the other members of the committee the opportunity to review the motion put forth so that we can actually have adequate debate and vote on that. But I turn the floor to Madame Rempel Garner.
Thank you for deeming it admissible. I believe my staff member right now, Madam Chair, is circulating the motion in both official languages to all parliamentarians' personal accounts, as well as to the clerk of the committee. So it is in order. And I mean, I can speak to it briefly here. Here is my concern. We're getting a lot of reports in the media about this problem, and I think we need to look at it objectively, and I think that place is our committee. So how many companies could this be affected by this particular issue? In what industries? And does the ICA net benefit review trigger at the right threshold given the devaluation of assets? I'm seeing more this weekend. I saw a lot of coverage of this, and we're running out of time in June. We're at the beginning of the month already. So given that our next scheduled meeting isn't until Friday, I'm not comfortable waiting for a week to move this motion. I think it's something that is fairly straightforward and should be disposed of today.
With that, I'd like to ask if it's possible, Madame Rempel Garner, because it's being distributed, I believe, as you mentioned, as we speak. Would it be possible that we can come back to this at the end of this meeting so that we can continue with the testimony of the witnesses we have here, and we can make sure that we leave some time at the end of the meeting to discuss? Would that be amendable to you?
Well, I'd rather put a timeline on it so that we don't run out of time to discuss it and then not meet till Friday about it.
I'd like to give the members the opportunity to see, and I understand it's being circulated, but we can always keep 10 minutes at the end of the meeting if that'd be acceptable to you so that we can discuss. I'd
prefer to start with debate if that's possible, Madam Chair. I can read it again.
Madam Chair?
I mean, it's like, look, here's the thing. We are meeting virtually. And these are the realities of virtual meetings, right? So if we were sitting in person in Parliament, we would be debating this and discussing it and not suspending, as we always do with motions. And I would like to proceed with the discussion of this motion.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Mr. Longfield?
I think we've got some incredible witnesses here that I'd really like to ask questions to, and I like your idea of taking it to the end of the meeting. I haven't seen the motion yet. I've sure heard a lot of great testimony that I want to dive into, and I wouldn't want to use this committee to not talk to the witnesses that are now in front of us.
Any further debate?
Yeah,
Madam
Chair.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm comfortable with this. I've just studied the Investment Canada Act a number of times, and we did get the email. I'm ready to call a vote for the motion. It's straightforward. If we're going to study the Investment Canada Act, we can work out the details later. We can get to testimony. So I'd ask you to call the question and get this done. It leaves a lot of openness the way the motion's been set forth. So that's what my preference is, to call the question and get this done and hear our testimony. That would be the normal operating procedure we do in the House of Commons. So just if we can continue that'd be great, because then we can hear the testimony.
We have a few members here that would like to intervene as well. We have Mr. Erskine Smith as well as Mr. Asasi. Mr. Erskine Smith.
Thanks. I just had a question because I did listen to the motion, but I haven't seen the text and some of it flew by quite quickly. So how many meetings were you expecting to have, Ms. Rempel?
Thank you, Mr. Erskine Smith. I suggested 4. I would be open if we wanted to have a meeting to discuss business on how many we go into, but I'd like to hear from the department. I'd like to hear from members of the financial industry, people from relevant affected sectors, experts who have been giving advice in the media on this particular issue, and I'd like to get some data and quantify it. So I put the number of meetings as 4, so that would be approximately a 2-week study. I'm happy to have more than that if need be, but I think we can probably bang this out fairly quickly. The goal would be expediency, given that I would think that these transactions are being looked at right now and these situations are escalating. And I think that it's incumbent upon Parliament and our committee, it's directly within the scope of our work to provide advice to the government on this.
That makes, it sounds reasonable from what I've heard. My only concern, given I didn't know it was coming forward, is we don't have that many meetings left as before we rise. Maybe we can meet into July in some way, but there are other things we can discuss too. And I'm very interested in discussing recovery and focusing on a number of recommendations to government on what recovery ought to look like. And so it does become how we can best use finite time that we have. And so if it's 4 meetings at the expense of a series of other meetings on other topics, then some time to think about it would be nice in terms of how the calendar plays out. But in terms of a specific one-off study, it sounds reasonable.
Okay, we have Mr. Asasi.
Madam Chair, I would heed the advice that you provided. I think we've have an incredible opportunity today to hear from people who are, first of all, very, very busy, have taken time out of those schedules to benefit us from their input. And much like you suggested, it would be a much better approach for us to hash out all the details after we have heard from the witnesses. I understand the keen desire of the member to focus on this, but she had ample opportunity to bring this to our attention before. And I find it regrettable that we're not making the best of the witnesses that have very generously committed of their time to be with us today. I think there should be a process in place. Again, as all of the members have indicated, there are a number of different details that we have to look into before we can reasonably consider this motion. So I would ask that we defer this discussion till we've had a chance to hear from the witnesses and that we return to this issue, I might add, after we have heard from the witnesses.
Madam Chair, just a quick point of order. We will get our vote following the interventions of the people you had on your list, because I've called for the question. So I just want to make sure we're going to have a quick vote after that, so we can just once the interventions are done. Is that correct?
Procedurally, we have to collapse debate. We still have some folks who would like to debate the motion before us. So, Mr. Lemire, vous avez le parole.
The floor is yours, sir. Mr. Lemire? Mr. Lemire? Yes, sorry, there was a bit of lag, unfortunately. I am ready to vote and support the motion. In fact, the time that we're spending to debate this motion will hamper our witnesses' testimony. So I think we're ready to vote and call the question.
Further debate on the motion before us? Madame Labropoulos?
Yeah, so similar to Nate's point, I actually sent a motion to the clerk today, or we're in the process of sending one to finalize the current study that we're doing and to have a report written and recommendations made. And just given the amount of time, we don't know exactly how long we will be sitting, and we haven't really discussed as a committee when we want this committee to end for the summer. So just maybe to have some kind of a discussion on a timeline. I have no problem with Ms. Rempel Garner's motion, but I'd also like to make sure that we get to do this report that we're currently working on properly, and that we get to take into account all of the different things that we would like to include.
Is there any further debate on the motion before us? Mr. Erskine-Smith?
So I would have thought, I mean, there's no reason to jam us with a motion like this. There's no reason to not have our committee meet in camera and discuss committee business as we normally do based on past practice and just being reasonable with one another. So if we are to put this to call the question now, I'll be voting against it just because it's incredibly unreasonable to put this forward as you have, Ms. Rempel. I mean, you are free to talk to us as colleagues. You are free to communicate with us in advance. You are free to give notice as is expected, and you don't have to, I understand. And you are also free to have an in-camera meeting where we discuss committee business as we normally do. If you're going to jam us with it, then no, although it sounds reasonable. My concern is finite time. There are lots of different things we could discuss. Is this worth 4 meetings in comparison to other things we could discuss? Maybe, but it's worth having a debate and not jamming us when we've got witnesses here. So if we're going to call the question now, fine, I'll vote against it. If it comes back, maybe it's reasonable, I can consider it at greater length, and maybe I'll vote for it.
Madame Rempel Garner?
To Mr. Erskine-Smith, through you, you might want to have a chat with your chair about informal conversations that were had about this particular meeting being a meeting to discuss business, which didn't happen in consultation with members of this committee. Afterwards, we got a notice of motion, to use the term jammed. The other thing is I do not need a lecture on my rights as a parliamentarian to move motions related to business at hand. I don't need that. So I understand this. I've tried to word it as neutrally as possible, as open as possible, so this committee can come to an objective, rational position on a very hot topic. And just because members of this committee can't think quickly enough, as so it seems, I don't need a lecture. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Is there any further debate on the motion before the committee?
Madam Chair, I'd like to put an amendment that we look at the timeline differently, that the timeline would be after we complete this study.
Okay, we have an amendment on the floor. Any debate on the amendment? Madame Rempel Garner?
Well, Madam Chair, since I will note that there is no timeline on this study, so I don't know when it's going to be completed. I wouldn't support this amendment because right now, this is a very hot topic where there are companies, there are strategic assets where we should be talking about, are we allowing authoritarian countries and governments to purchase strategic assets in Canada? It's the headline of every news. There's a lot of stuff happening right now. I don't understand why we couldn't spend 4 meetings in the next 2 weeks and look at this important issue. I don't want it to be punted down the road. This is something that should be timely looked at immediately, as per my remarks to you. And I definitely don't want this to be punted to the end of an indefinite study that has no scope, that was forced upon us due to the suspension of the House of Commons. I don't find that acceptable.
Madam Chair, on the amendment, I won't be supporting that. It's just a filibuster from our witnesses' testimony right now. It's a straightforward motion that we have. We either support it, we don't, then we can hear our witnesses' testimonies. Any other business than that is just filibustering our current witnesses.
So with that, I'd like to know if there's any more debate with respect to the amendment that's put forward. If there is no further debate on the amendment, we will call for the recorded division on the amendment. I will turn to the clerk. Sorry, recorded votes, not division.
Yeah, no, it's a recorded division. Thank you. So the question is on the amendment of Mr. Longfield that this new study take place immediately following the current study on COVID-19. So, Mr. Erskine-Smith.
Mr. Erskine-Smith, you're still on mute.
I abstain. I have no particular view on the amendment.
Okay, Ms. Lambropoulos.
In favor.
Mr. Jahouri.
In favor.
Mr. Assassi.
In favor.
Mr. Longfield.
In favor.
Ms. Rempel Garner.
Opposed.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Opposed.
Ms. Gray.
Opposed.
Mr. Patzer.
Opposed.
Monsieur Lemire.
Mr. Lemire, against.
So that is 6 nays and 4 yeas.
I declare the amendment defeated. We will now move back to the original motion before the committee. Is there any further debate? Seeing no further debate on the original motion put forth by Madame Rempel Garner, I will turn it to the clerk for the recorded division.
Okay, Mr. Erskine-Smith.
No.
Ms. Lambropoulos.
No.
Mr. Jahouri.
No.
Mr. Assassi.
Nope.
Mr. Longfield.
No.
Ms. Rempel Garner.
In favor.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Yes.
Ms. Gray.
Yes.
Mr. Patzer.
Yes.
Monsieur Lemire.
Mr. Lemire. Yes, voting for.
6 yeas, 5 nays.
I therefore declare the motion carried.